Time now for the news review of this bulletin. The German foreign minister has called for resuming dialogue between the Western military alliance, NATO, and Russia. Heiko Maas was speaking on the sidelines of a meeting of foreign ministers from NATO member states in Brussels. The top German diplomat added that the ball is in Russia's court to resume talks with the alliance through a council that last met in July 2019. Ties between the West and Russia are at post-Cold War lows. This is rooted in issues ranging from disagreements over Ukraine and Syria crisis to allegations of hacking U.S. elections. The U.S. is also trying to revitalize NATO after 4 years, when the former administration of Donald Trump portrayed it as outdated, divided, and in crisis. Joining us is Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, journalist, and author from London. We also have Fred Weir, who's a veteran journalist and commentator who joins us from Moscow. Okay, Fred Weir, let me first start with you. Why is there an interest for this relationship between NATO and Russia to be revitalized? The German foreign minister has said that. Antony Blinken has come out and said that. What reasons do you see?
Well, there is a growing rift between Europe and the United States over how to deal with Russia, or more precisely, some European states like Germany and France, who would like to revitalize ties. I mean, I think there's general agreement that we are at the lowest level of the relationship, especially between Europe, well, never mind the United States, between Europe and Russia since the end of the Cold War. And there are like just so many problems that need to be resolved. However, NATO is not in itself an organization the Russians are likely to want to deal with. It is, you know, the hostilities have mounted. It's not just about NATO expansion, it's about building up forces near Russia's border, and the general atmosphere of identifying Russia as the major threat. So I don't see much perspective in revitalizing ties with NATO through that council. They tried once during the recent crisis. It fell apart. It's in the present diplomatic atmosphere, it's completely unlikely to go anywhere. But other diplomatic channels, especially directly between countries like Germany and Russia, they have some prospects, and there are reasons to hope.
Marcus Papadopoulos, when you take a look at this, it could be a question that should be directed not only at whether this relationship needs to be revitalized, but whether NATO in itself, as an entity or organization, needs to even be there. There's some that argue NATO's existence is not necessary anymore. Do you think that's the case? Do you think, however, that Russia should entertain and receive the fact that NATO and some member countries want a relationship with Russia to be revitalized?
First of all, how deeply poignant it is that we are discussing NATO when today, the 24th of March, marks the 22nd anniversary of NATO's illegal and brutal bombing campaign against Serbia, or as it was then, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, in support of a terrorist and organized crime syndicate, namely the so-called Kosovo Liberation Army. Accordingly, it is suffice to say that NATO is a murderously criminal military bloc of the highest order. Now, turning to NATO-Russia relations, the audacity of the German foreign minister to say that the ball is in Russia's court is quite striking, because it is NATO who has flagrantly violated the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997 by having established a permanent military presence on Russia's borders. It is not Russia who has violated that cornerstone agreement between NATO and Russia. It is not Russia who has a military bloc of its own on, for example, Germany's border, or France's border, or America's border, or Canada's border. So if there is to be a thaw in relations between NATO and Russia, and we should all strive and pray for a thaw in relations between NATO and Russia, the ball is actually in the court of NATO. NATO, first of all, needs to end its permanent military presence on the western borders of the Russian Federation. NATO has to put into writing that it will not admit Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia into its military bloc. Then, and only then, will there be a real possibility of an improvement in ties between NATO and Russia. Alas, that is not going to happen, because NATO is spearheading the American and British objective of placing a cordon sanitaire on the western borders of the Russian Federation to weaken Russian influence and power in Europe, and thereby weaken Russian influence and power on the global scene in general.
Well, looking at what Anthony Blinken has said, Fred Weir, it's saying that the ball is in Russia's court at this point, and whether it's going to go ahead with this so-called invitation, if you want to call it that. And of course, it's cited some of the areas of concern. So what would happen if Russia just said, I'm not interested?
I think that's what Russia will say. It is hard to see what Russia could do. I mean, in a way that could be justified in terms of Russian foreign policy, to create this situation where NATO would graciously agree to reconvene that committee. It's a non-starter, I'm afraid. I think that it's being mentioned, it's being brought up for those politicians to say, well, we tried. Because I think what we're in store for is a far more acrimony, far tougher sanctions and other measures against Russia. So they wanted on the record that they held out the olive branch. The Russians didn't respond, and of course, I think it's sort of a set piece. That's what's going on there.
Very well. Thank you very much, Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, journalist, and author, and thank you, Fred Weir, veteran journalist and commentator. That brings us to the end of this news review.